It was meant to be just another quiet evening in the village, until a single forgotten letter unlocked a decades-old silence, and with it a storm of guilt, grief and reckoning that had been buried beneath lace curtains and lavender tea for far too long. There are moments when a village seems to hold its breath, not out of peace but out of caution, and on that particular afternoon in Elmsworth, spring felt less like a renewal and more like a pause before revelation. Beneath the arching boughs of cherry blossoms heavy with petals that fluttered like torn whispers in the breeze, the old rectory garden appeared as if carved from a forgotten memory, too perfect, too still, almost rehearsed. The trimmed hedges, the faint scent of lilac and lavender drifting lazily through the air. The sun dappled through branches like fractured glass. It all lent an unsettling kind of beauty, like a portrait hiding blood beneath the paint. A long trestle table stood beneath the largest cherry tree, veiled in a fine white cloth that fluttered at the corners, pinned in place with antique silver forks that seemed more like wards against disturbance than mere weight. 4 chairs encircled it, each mismatched, well-worn but chosen with care, and at their head sat Mrs. Halworth, the rector's wife, her hands never still, smoothing out creases that weren't there, adjusting cutlery that hadn't moved. She was the type of woman who held storms inside her sleeves and offered tea with the same grace she might wield a sword. The first to arrive was Miss Alden, thin-lipped, always watching, her eyes moving with the speed of gossip and the weight of judgment, followed shortly by Edith Wren, whose reputation for perfectionism and quiet cruelty was as neatly ironed as the gloves she wore. They exchanged soft, curated words, but the silence between them was loud with unspoken things. Then came the sound, the subtle crunch of gravel beneath careful feet, and the air shifted. Mrs. Calloway had arrived. In a village like Elmsworth, time didn't forgive easily, and though she'd lived there 4 years, her presence still felt foreign, her late husband's sudden death just 3 months prior, still a quiet storm that hadn't passed. Dressed in charcoal grey silk with a black veil that shimmered like a shadow caught in daylight, her silver hair pinned with ruthless precision, she entered not as a guest but as a question. Without a word she slid into the seat that had always been Miss Wren's, her claim silent but thunderous. Miss Wren blinked once, slow and hard, then sat beside Miss Alden with a smile that tasted of steel. Tea had not yet been poured when the final guest appeared, and though her steps were soft, her presence changed everything. Miss Elspeth Maud, ancient, unreadable, dressed in lavender and calm, walked in carrying a book and an air of someone who had already seen the end of the story. She did not apologize for her lateness, nor did anyone expect her to. Her eyes, pale as rain clouds and just as heavy, passed over each face, pausing on Mrs. Calloway, then flicking briefly to the empty cup set before Miss Wren. Dora, the maid, nervous and new, had arranged the tea set with rigid care, placing each cup exactly as tradition dictated, the chipped rose china for Miss Wren, the Wedgwood blue for Miss Alden, a plain silver-rimmed cup for Mrs. Halworth, and a modest brown earthenware for Miss Maud. Yet when the tray circled, something shifted. Perhaps it was inexperience, perhaps it was something darker, but Mrs. Calloway reached, without hesitation, for the rose-patterned cup meant for Miss Wren. Her fingers closed around it with the kind of grace that can be mistaken for innocence, but Miss Wren's jaw twitched ever so slightly. No one spoke, no one corrected her. Miss Wren accepted the bland white cup without a word, but her smile grew a fraction too wide, and her gaze lingered a second too long. The tea began to pour. Small talk drifted up like mist about the late bloom, the finches, the soil, but underneath the silence grew teeth. Miss Maud did not sip her tea. She watched. Her hands moved calmly, her fingers tapping once on the handle of her cup, eyes scanning the delicate dance of hands and china, of trembling spoons and shifting glances. The cherry blossoms rained down in soft, slow patterns as though marking time to something inevitable. Grief was not mentioned, but it was there in the tremor of a cup, in the press of lips, in the sharp way Mrs. Halworth folded her napkin. And then there was the cup, the wrong cup, in the wrong hands. In Elmsworth, nothing ever happened without reason, and no one took what wasn't quietly theirs, unless they meant to disturb the order. Miss Maud finally raised her teacup, eyes never leaving Mrs. Calloway, and in that quiet, fragile garden where the past had always stayed politely buried, something ancient and patient began to stir, something that had been waiting for just such a mistake. It happened in a moment so quietly strange that for a heartbeat, no one truly registered its weight, as if reality had tilted ever so slightly on its axis and left the garden just a fraction off balance. Mrs. Calloway, the widow whose presence still carried the solemnity of her husband's funeral, sat poised on her chair, her scone untouched, her teacup cradled in fingers that trembled not from age, but from something deeper and more sudden. The air had grown warm, unseasonably so, with sunlight filtering through the cherry blossom branches in a haze that blurred edges and lulled the senses, until she pressed one frail hand to her chest, the other clawing faintly at the table's edge. Her expression was not of pain but bewilderment, the kind that belongs to someone realizing far too late that something has gone terribly wrong inside their own body. A faint breath, almost a sigh, escaped her lips before the cup slipped from her grasp. It struck the flagstones with a delicate but final shatter, the floral porcelain fragments scattering like the pieces of a long-held illusion. For a moment there was only silence. Then a strangled cry from Miss Alden, a stifled scream caught in Edith Wren's throat, and the scraping of Lydia Hulworth's chair as she rose sharply, already calling for Edna. The maid, face pale and eyes wide with a kind of childlike horror, bolted for the doctor, nearly tripping on her way. But Miss Maud, ever the observer, didn't shout, didn't rush. She moved quietly to the widow's side, her hands gentle but purposeful as she took in the pallor of the skin, the twitch in the fingertips, the growing stillness in the limbs. Around them the spring garden seemed frozen, bees hovering mid-air, petals drifting slower than before, as though nature itself was waiting. Under the awning where shadows deepened, Dr. Langley arrived with his black leather bag that always smelled faintly of oil and damp pages. He knelt, examined and frowned, his face marked not by shock but a grim understanding. When he finally stood, brushing his palms together and avoiding the eyes of every woman gathered, his voice came like a soft verdict. "There are signs, consistent with digitalis." The word seemed to thud into the air, sharp as glass. Miss Alden gasped, Edna let out a sob, and Edith stared, transfixed at the broken cup as though it might reassemble and confess. No one spoke, but the silence was loud with implication. Poison, intent. Someone had meant for this to happen. And worse, they had chosen their moment. That night, as the garden was cleared and twilight folded itself across the village, a new current flowed through the cobbled lanes and lace-curtained parlours of Elmsworth. Digitalis was not a thing one encountered by accident. It was rare, potent and deliberate, and while the rector might speak of sudden illness and delicate constitutions, the villagers had already begun to murmur, at tea tables, in the corners of shops, under their breath with practiced care. They remembered Commander Calloway, the husband long gone, a man cold in manner, rigid in principle, whose sudden death just 3 months prior had felt oddly convenient. His will, difficult and vague, had sparked silent calculations. A nephew, once cast out, had reappeared weeks ago. A maid, recently dismissed, had spoken too loudly at the grocer's. Whispers multiplied like ivy, reaching even the most weathered walls. But Miss Maud did not speak. She watched. That evening she sat alone in her parlour, the air thick with the scent of rain on warm soil, the shadows long and slanting. Her knitting lay untouched in her lap, and her mind replayed each movement, the seating mix-up, the wrong cup in the wrong hands, the pause before the first sip. But that wasn't her cup, she murmured, as if the very air had ears. No, it had never been hers. Someone had made sure of that. In the days that followed, Elmsworth resumed its routine, but with a new tension beneath every polite smile and passing wave. The widow's death, now shrouded in silence and speculation, had opened something, an old wound, a buried secret, a quiet war of inheritance and reputation. And while others moved on, Miss Maud began to write, not letters but observations, names, gestures, moments. Her notebook, hidden behind a row of gardening manuals, filled with careful lines. Because here, in a village that believed itself safe, someone had plotted murder over tea. And Maud, she meant to find out who. There was something about the air that day. Warm, fragrant, deceptively gentle, that made the events unfolding in Ashmere Hollow all the more jarring, like a hand extended in kindness that suddenly grips too tight. Miss Agnes Hale, sharp-minded even in her twilight years, visited the ivy-laced cottage of Mrs. Bramley under the pretence of delivering a jar of quince jam and inquiring about the parish's hymnals, yet both women knew that true revelations rarely came through direct questions. Over tea in a room that smelled faintly of lavender polish and old paper, Mrs. Bramley, who had seen more than she let on and said less than she remembered, mentioned almost carelessly the arrival of a certain Mr. Thorne. A solicitor by profession, or so he claimed. He had appeared not long after the sudden death of Eleanora Graves, the widow who had once scandalized the village by purchasing a cottage with funds no one could trace. Mr. Thorne was not tied to any official matters, nor had he been summoned by the family. What little of it remained. And yet there he was, seen at the bakery, the bookshop, and 3 separate afternoons at the cottage of Miss Lenora Vale, Eleanora's reclusive cousin, whose quiet grief seemed layered with something far more brittle. He has a voice like someone folding letters that shouldn't be read, Mrs. Bramley had said, almost to herself. Agnes said nothing, but her thoughts stirred when she later spoke to the gardener's wife, a sharp-eyed woman who handled secrets like she handled shears with control and purpose. She learned that Mr. Thorne had once been seen leaving the east wing of the Hollow House at dusk, though no one had invited him. Lenora Vale, when asked directly, merely smiled and redirected the conversation to wildflowers, but Agnes noticed the hesitation in her eyes, the way her fingers pinched her shawl when the solicitor's name was mentioned. Then came the remark from young Nora Bell, a cleaner with a tendency to talk when nervous, who said she had set out the tea that day. White china with ivy trim, the same cups always used. She had placed the pink one with the rim crack at Miss Vale's usual seat, the ivy cup for Eleanor's, and the plain blue for the guest, just as instructed. Only Miss Vale didn't sit there this time, Nora had said, puzzled. She swapped seats just before they poured. No reason, no explanation, but she had taken Eleanor's cup, and it was Eleanora who had clutched at her throat minutes later and collapsed in the parlor, the sound of her fall barely louder than the whisper of steam from the kettle. At the time it had been called a heart failure. She'd always had a weak one after all, but with a solicitor appearing like fog, a cup changed without fuss, and a will revised days prior, Agnes Hale began to see the lines between events like stitches in a hem, subtle but unmistakably deliberate. Mr. Thorne's presence, his lack of paperwork, his quiet conversations with a grieving cousin who had more to gain than she pretended, none of it felt accidental. She recalled the old rule from her time working with the Red Cross during the war: when things appear too quiet, they've often just finished screaming. There was no outburst, no confrontation, just the soft rearrangement of teacups, the folding of wills, and the deadly quiet between shared glances. And now, as the village prepared for another Sunday, and the birds sang too loudly for comfort, Agnes knew that someone had traded guilt for inheritance, and had done so with the precision of someone who knew how to smile without ever truly meaning it. It was the kind of evening when the wind whispered down from the moor like a mourner at a graveside, brushing past ivy-covered cottages and rattling the panes of Elderwick Hollow with a chill that seemed less about weather and more about warning, and in such moments Miss Eliza Hartford always felt the veil between what is seen and what is hidden grow dangerously thin. Her visit to Florence Mercer's ivy-draped home was, on the surface, a social courtesy, an old friend calling upon another, but in truth it was a reconnaissance beneath the mask of pleasantries. Florence, a woman known for her well-trimmed rose hedges and barely disguised disdain for disorder, greeted her with that taut civility reserved for guests one cannot quite welcome nor send away. The tea was already set, 3 cups, each distinct, each with its own unspoken ownership, as was tradition in Elderwick Hollow, a place where even crockery followed social codes like silent gospel. They spoke of unimportant things: the failing choir pitch, the rusting village gates, the reverend's wife's new bonnet, but beneath the clink of porcelain and the scent of bergamot, tension simmered. It was only when Eliza gently, almost lazily, remarked on the unfortunate incident 2 days prior, the sudden collapse of Adelia Quinn in that very conservatory, that she noticed Florence's shoulders tighten, her eyes flick for the briefest moment toward the sideboard where the tea set still stood like witnesses refusing to forget. There were 3 cups set out that day: Florence's favoured ivory one with the faint marigold motif, Eliza's white glazed piece with the tiny etched vine, and Adelia's distinctive green and gold slightly chipped at the base, a flaw she often joked about, calling it character in china. Yet Clara Bell, the housemaid, later confessed in a flurry of nervous glances that when she returned to clear the service it was the ivory cup, Florence's usual, that bore the faint trace of undrunk jasmine tea and a curious bitter note on the rim. Mrs. Quinn, it seemed, had arrived early and taken her place without waiting. "I think she liked the marigold design," Clara had stammered, said it matched her brooch. Florence, when confronted with this small deviation, had responded too quickly, too rehearsed. "It's just a cup, Eliza. Let's not weave drama into crockery." But Eliza had seen it, the fleeting flicker of something deeper in Florence's eyes. Not grief, not shock, but a silent calculation interrupted. That night, Eliza sat by the fireside, her knitting untouched in her lap, her thoughts stitching connections faster than wool through needles. The tea had been poisoned. That much was certain now, the faint bitter almond scent a telltale whisper of belladonna, expertly dosed to mimic heart failure in the elderly. But the poison had not been in Adelia's cup. It had been meant for someone else, someone who always took the ivory one. Florence. The pieces didn't align perfectly yet, but Eliza knew too much about patterns, whether in needlework, conversation or crime, to ignore the symmetry. A mistake had been made, a switch, a victim unintended, and in that mistake, the shadows had shifted. The next morning, under the pretense of asking Clara for her poppy seed cake recipe, Eliza visited again, this time alone. Clara, flustered but flattered, spilled more than ingredients, mentioning that Florence had been receiving letters lately, unmarked, often burned in the half minutes after reading them. She said they were from her sister in Kent, Clara murmured, but her sister died 3 years ago, didn't she? Eliza's breath caught. That was the crack in the facade. Someone had been blackmailing Florence or threatening her, and Florence in her desperation might have sought to silence the danger permanently. But had she acted alone? Had someone helped her mix the deadly brew? Or perhaps someone else had anticipated Florence's move and altered the plan to strike first? Eliza closed her eyes, just for a moment, letting the scent of firewood and something older, secrets long buried, linger in her mind. The game had changed. The village, with all its tidy hedgerows and polite smiles, had become a chessboard. One move had gone awry, and now the players were scrambling, lying, watching. Somewhere among them, the real killer was waiting, thinking they had escaped justice thanks to a simple mistake in teacups. But Eliza Hartford, with her quiet voice and sharper-than-silver mind, had seen too much, heard too much, and guessed just enough to begin pulling at the thread. And when that thread finally unraveled, it would not just reveal a killer, it would expose the dark underbelly of a village that had mistaken silence for safety for far too long. In East Wetherham, the Thursday afternoon tea had long been more ritual than refreshment, where every saucer had a history, and each cup a loyalty. Alliances forged not in words but in repetition, habit, and the subtle choreography of the well-bred. So when Mrs. Imogen Hale, a woman of modest lineage but recent arrival, collapsed quietly mid-sentence, her chin grazing the rim of the cornflower blue cup, the first gasp was not for death but for disruption. Silence followed, not out of shock but confusion, as if the air itself was scrambling to rearrange the etiquette that had just been so savagely broken. It was Miss Henrietta Blythe, sharp of tongue and even sharper of memory, who noticed first what the others only felt. Imogen Hale had never ever used that cup. That cup, white bone china rimmed with cobalt bands, had always belonged to Cecilia Trent, a fixture of the village, unmarried, observant, and often underestimated. But Cecilia had been delayed, briefly and inconveniently, by a parcel from the apothecary that had arrived precisely at the moment tea was being served, a parcel she had neither requested nor expected. The chairs had been filled when she returned, and with polite resignation she had taken the last vacant seat without protest. The cornflower cup, her usual, had been claimed. No one thought much of it at the time. Such slips were common, and usually harmless, but the arrival of the coroner's report changed that forever. Belladonna. Precisely administered, tasteless once steeped and fast-acting, not a carelessly left household poison, but one chosen, measured, and introduced with deliberate timing. The implication tightened around the community like a drawn cord. Someone in that room had planned a murder, but not of Imogen. The poison had been meant for Cecilia Trent, and death, indifferent to intention, had merely followed habit, not justice. Miss Blythe, in her quiet way, reconstructed the entire seating from memory, tracing the rituals of pouring, passing, sipping and smiling with the same precision she'd once applied to correcting essays. She noted how the cups were arranged not just out of decorum, but expectation. The cornflower blue cup was always placed at the third seat from the window, a location Cecilia preferred because the afternoon light didn't glare off her spectacles. Edna, the maid, had followed this unspoken tradition as always. The poison, then, had been placed not for a person, but for a habit, predictable, deeply ingrained and easy to exploit. Which begged the question, who knew Cecilia well enough to count on that predictability, and more importantly, who resented her enough to kill? Suspicion danced like shadows in lamplight. Cecilia's stoic demeanor shifted. She spoke less, observed more, and once was overheard murmuring, "I think I've survived the wrong fate." But what unsettled Miss Blythe most was not the tremble in Cecilia's voice or the memory of Imogen's fall, it was the sudden absence of bees in Cecilia's garden. A woman who once cultivated lavender and foxglove with meticulous care now seemed to avoid her garden entirely, as though life itself had grown too dangerous to tend. When Miss Blythe visited under the pretense of returning a hymnal, Cecilia offered tea but did not drink it herself. She sat stiffly, hands folded too tightly in her lap, and answered in clipped fragments. When gently asked how she had felt watching Imogen collapse, she said flatly, "I felt as though I had been erased from a page that was meant for me." It was the kind of statement that chilled more in retrospect. That night Miss Blythe lay awake with the full weight of implication. The parcel from the apothecary had no sender. The tea service had been disrupted not by error, but orchestration. And most damning of all, Cecilia's survival was not a triumph of fate, but an irritation to someone who had already failed once. A week later, Cecilia vanished. A note was left, 4 words, written with a heavy hand, "It won't miss twice." The village assumed grief. Miss Blythe assumed otherwise. The killer, she feared, had not abandoned their plan. They had merely recalibrated, and in East Wetherham, where everyone knew everyone's habits, that made everyone a suspect and everyone a target. It was shortly after the bells of St. Aldwyn's Church fell silent, those heavy, deliberate tolls that always seem to echo longer than they should in a village so small, that Clara Ellison, her veil still soaked with rain and unshed grief, uttered a line that would later reverberate like a secret confession through the drawing rooms and cobbled lanes of the village. Some shadows never lift, even in daylight. It wasn't sorrow that laced her voice, nor fear, but a strained composure, as if she were battling to keep something buried beneath layers of mourning lace and tightly folded hands. Miss Elspeth Grange, seated across from her near the fireplace, noticed the way Clara's fingers dug slightly into the porcelain handle of her teacup, the violet-trimmed one she had never touched in all the years of village gatherings. That cup had always been set aside for Beatrice Lorne, now lying in the crypt with lilies on her coffin and unanswered questions whispering through the pews. Miss Grange, known by the village simply as the quiet widow who bred roses and rarely missed Sunday service, had spent too long reading between silences to ignore the tremor in Clara's carefully controlled reply. And later that evening, as the fire cracked low and a storm rolled in from the moors, she replayed every moment from the wake with the meticulousness of someone accustomed to spotting the lie hidden inside the polite truth. The seating had been informal but not random. Nothing ever truly was in a village where cups were chosen by habit more than preference. The violet-rimmed teacup had stood in its usual place at the second position from the hearth, where Beatrice always sat, claiming the warmth helped her aching knees. Clara, never before drawn to that spot, had taken it this time, unthinking, or so it seemed. But Miss Grange no longer believed in unthinking moments, not when the scent clinging to that particular cup was not of Earl Grey or milk polish, but of lavender, a soft, sweet floral essence that had no place at that table. And lavender, as she recalled from an old journal of apothecarial notes kept by her grandfather, had once been used to dull the bitterness of toxic compounds, atropine, belladonna, deadly nightshade. As her thoughts spun further into shadows long dismissed, she remembered another incident, decades old, never spoken of but never entirely forgotten. Alice Merton, a scullery maid in the Davenham household, had vanished on a similar rain-lashed evening. No body, no note, only a soaked apron found tangled in the reeds near the mill stream, and hushed rumours of an affair gone wrong between Alice and a man of higher standing. Clara's father, Thomas Ellison, had abruptly left the country 2 weeks later, citing business in South Africa, and had never returned. The village had moved on, as villages do, smoothing over the scandal with weddings, births and time. But Miss Grange remembered the look in young Clara's eyes then, too knowing, too old for 12. And now, all these years later, another woman dead, another sudden absence of logic wrapped in lace and lemon biscuits, and that same unsettling silence in Clara's gaze. When Dr. Harrow returned to the village unannounced the next morning, his suit slightly wrinkled, his tone too polished, it only confirmed Miss Grange's growing certainty that the past had not stayed buried. He greeted her with his usual charm, but the moment she mentioned Beatrice's sudden collapse, his jaw tightened a fraction too quickly. "This place remembers too much," he said, not meeting her eyes, "and forgives far too little." That night, as the rain streaked her window and the village settled into the illusion of safety, Miss Grange carefully retrieved the teacup tray from the vicar's wife, who had found it odd she'd asked. Nothing seemed amiss until Miss Grange leaned in and inhaled the faint, cloying perfume of lavender from the one cup no longer clean but simply rinsed. She placed the cup beside her grandfather's old book of village herbs, and the realization crept in slow, ice-cold certainty. Someone had poisoned Beatrice, but Beatrice had not been the intended target. The cup had been meant for Clara, but fate, or perhaps hesitation, had intervened, and now someone knew Miss Grange was asking questions. Her rose bushes were trampled the next morning, and the latch on her garden gate, always firm, was left swinging open. It wasn't just about tea or death or memories, it was about a village where grudges fermented over decades, where smiles masked accusations, and where one wrong sip could unravel secrets sewn into bloodlines. And as the wind howled that night through the hedges like the echoes of the long-forgotten dead, Miss Grange stared into the dark beyond her curtains and realized something chilling. The person who had poisoned Beatrice hadn't failed. They were waiting for the next cup to be poured. There had never been an official inquiry into Margaret Vale's disappearance. No inquest, no police file left in some dusty archive, only the faint residue of whispers passed from porch to parlor over decades, softened by time, but never truly forgotten. The villagers of Elmridge Hollow had long accepted the incident as one of those unfortunate matters best left unspoken, filed under the category of delicate female minds and private family troubles. But Eleanor Blackwood, who now lived alone in a house where the walls still remembered voices, had always known something was wrong. She had not wept when Margaret vanished, nor had she lit candles in chapel vigils like the others. Instead, she had watched and remembered, for Eleanor had seen Margaret the night before she disappeared, standing beneath the overgrown pergola at Brookgate Manor, speaking in low, urgent tones to a man whose face had never been introduced to the village, a man whose hands lingered too long on Margaret's wrist, whose words carried an edge Eleanor had never forgotten. And now, 33 years later, that same unease returned like a shadow lengthening at dusk. It began with a simple thing. A girl fainting at a spring gathering, her teacup clattering against the garden stones like a signal. Young Isabel Grain, bright and curious, and far too perceptive for her own safety, had been sipping from a china cup painted with tiny violets when her body gave way. At first they blamed the heat, the tight corseting, the excitement of too much attention, but Eleanor had smelled it immediately, the sweet, cloying aroma wafting from the rim of the cup. Not elderflower this time, but marjoram, soft and deceptive, long used to mask the bitter taste of tinctures never meant to be ingested. The same scent that had once clung to Margaret's dressing gown, dismissed by the housekeeper as herbal sachets for sleep. But Eleanor knew it now for what it was, warning in disguise. That evening, after the guests had departed and the vicar's wife had retired, Eleanor requested to see the tea tray once more under the pretense of helping with the cleanup. The cups had been washed, but porcelain retains memory in its quiet way. One particular cup, Isabel's, still held a trace of the scent. Eleanor turned it in her hands, her mind racing, not just through memory, but through possibility. It was happening again. And just like before, there would be no constable, no headline, only another hush, another name slowly removed from conversation until nothing remained. But Eleanor would not let that happen. She returned home and retrieved a small locked chest from beneath the floorboards, untouched for decades. Inside lay Margaret's photograph, a pressed wildflower, and something no one else knew existed, a fragment of a torn letter. Eleanor had taken it the night Margaret vanished, found it snagged in the branches beneath her window. The ink had faded, but a single line was still legible. "If I disappear, it is not of my own choosing." Eleanor had once convinced herself that Margaret had run away, fled the suffocation of the house, the unspoken shame, but now, with Isabel nearly joining her fate, that illusion crumbled. She visited the manor the next day, under the guise of delivering old books for the library. The family had changed, but the walls remained the same, and as she stepped into the old greenhouse abandoned, dusty, half swallowed by ivy, she saw it, a pair of boots, child-sized, left neatly under a bench, the same kind Margaret wore. No one had mentioned them, no one claimed them. As she knelt to examine them, she found tucked inside a brittle envelope, sealed and water-damaged, but still intact. Inside a letter, the full letter, in Margaret's trembling hand. "He told me if I spoke, no one would believe me, that he would ruin me. But I've written it down, names, dates. If something happens, look in the greenhouse. I couldn't hide forever." Eleanor's hands trembled, not from fear, but from rage. Margaret had tried to save herself with truth, and now that truth had finally surfaced, as dangerous as it had been the day it was written. That evening her window was left ajar, though she hadn't opened it. On her pillow was a crushed sprig of marjoram. They knew. Someone still watched. Someone who had silenced Margaret and now wanted Eleanor quiet too. But they had made a mistake. They had forgotten that Eleanor Blackwood had spent a lifetime among books and secrets, and that she had waited 33 years for this very moment. The past was no longer a memory. It was a weapon, and this time she would wield it. It was always the smallest things that gave the past permission to stir. The accidental unlocking of an old drawer, the scent of something half-remembered, or in this case a misplaced letter found wedged beneath a floorboard, long thought sealed. Amelia Thornfield had never meant to find it. She had been searching for a dropped hairpin when her fingers brushed parchment dry as bone and nearly translucent with age. At first she thought it was nothing, a crumpled envelope without address, but as she opened it and the brittle ink breathed secrets onto her skin, she realized what she held was not only dangerous but damning. It spoke of a child born in silence and hidden in plain sight, of an arrangement made to protect not the innocent, but the reputations of those who had orchestrated it. The signature was unmistakable. Catherine Elstone, presumed dead these 25 years after falling from the cliffs near Marrow Bay. But the letter was dated 2 days after her supposed death. It wasn't grief that silenced the village back then, it was complicity. Now, as Inspector Alden Graves stared at the photograph on his desk, a grainy image of Catherine smiling beside her younger cousin Margaret on the Elstone estate's last known summer gathering, he felt the cold breath of something ancient pressing down on his spine. Catherine had not died, or if she had, it had not been when or how they were told. Amelia, shaken but resolute, brought the letter to the rectory where Miss Della Havers resided, a former schoolmistress with a reputation for precision, discretion, and an almost supernatural memory for detail. Della, upon reading it, didn't gasp or faint. She simply nodded, stood, and fetched a small wooden box from her cabinet, labelled simply, C. Inside were notes, newspaper clippings, and a pressed violet, the same flower Catherine wore in her hair the day she vanished. "I knew it would come back," Della murmured. "They buried truth in the garden that summer, thinking it wouldn't bloom, but some roots rot slowly." Wordlessly, she handed Amelia a folded sheet in another hand, Margaret's confirming Catherine had planned to leave, not alone, but with someone else. A name was smudged, but it began with Thirk. Graves, called in quietly by Della to avoid the village tongues, listened to the story without interrupting, his jaw tight. He'd heard tales of the Elstone estate's fall from grace, of madness, whispered in bloodlines, of quiet departures, of servants dismissed with severance too generous to question. He'd dismissed them as Gothic law, but now they lined up like soldiers at a forgotten parade. As he traced the timeline, he saw what Della had long suspected: the girl they buried as Catherine may have never been Catherine at all. The estate physician, Dr. Linton, long retired and half-blind, was the last person to identify the body. He had, in confidence, once told Della that the face was beyond recognition, but the ring on her hand told me all I needed to know. But the ring, Catherine's mother's heirloom, had turned up in a pawnshop just last year in Devon, purchased by a man whose surname happened to match the Elstones' former stable boy. A boy who vanished a week before Catherine died. Now, as Graves stood before the boarded ruins of the estate, newly disturbed earth caught his eye near the old chapel, a place once off-limits to the staff. A quick dig with his boot exposed the corner of a metal box. Inside, beneath mouldy linens, lay a second letter, signed again by Catherine, but this time dated a year after her official death. "He promised we'd be free," it read. But he changed. He said the only way to keep the truth safe was to make sure no one else ever knew it. "I've hidden what I could. If someone finds this, don't trust him. Don't trust anyone who claims to protect the Elstone name." Graves now knew why the estate was sold hastily, why witnesses had been paid off, and why every mention of Catherine's last days had been so maddeningly vague. Someone had tried to erase her, not just from the village but from memory itself. But memory, like paper, burns unevenly, and this time the flame had left a name. Inspector Graves didn't speak much as Amelia turned to leave, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something almost imperceptible, a tightening of thought, a shift in suspicion. He had listened to many theories before, dismissed most without ceremony, yet this one clung to the edges of his mind like the damp fog curling against the windows outside. As Amelia's figure disappeared into the late afternoon mist, he found himself watching her more carefully than usual, not because he doubted her, but because deep down he knew she was no ordinary old woman. She had arrived not to speculate, but to illuminate the cracks others ignored. In the days that followed, change crept through the village not in loud announcements, but through small unsettling details. Eleanor Greaves, once the untouchable matriarch of St. Hilda's social circles, began to wither, not in body alone, but in presence. Her perfectly timed smiles faltered into silence. She no longer corrected the choir's pitch or reorganized flower vases in the parish hall. Churchgoers whispered of her absences. Mrs. Cranley, who sat 3 pews behind her every Sunday for 19 years, noted that Eleanor's hands now trembled as she received communion. The postmistress saw her weeping quietly one morning over a misaddressed letter, and Miss Havers, who watched with sharper eyes than most, realized the truth. Eleanor Greaves was not grieving a friend, she was being hunted by something much older than sorrow. It was not guilt that haunted Eleanor, at least not at first. It was the unspoken knowledge that someone out there had marked her, not randomly, not recently, but long ago. Mrs. Arleston's sudden death, while initially attributed to a tragic mistake, began to feel more and more like a warning. And if it had been intended for someone else, someone like Eleanor, then every day since the funeral had become a countdown. Her meals went untouched. She no longer opened her windows. Even her dog Barkley began sleeping under her bed, restless and growling at shadows. Then came the second incident, quiet like the first, and just as precise. It was a Thursday afternoon, grey-skied and damp. Eleanor, as had become routine, retired to her drawing room to rest, the day's mail unopened beside her. Clara, the housemaid, brought the doctor's prescribed tonic, a pale liquid meant to settle her nerves. Eleanor drank it, placed the bottle aside and closed her eyes. But an hour later, Clara found her slumped in her armchair, face pale, lips blue, her breathing shallow and rapid. Panic struck. The doctor came within minutes, his brows furrowed deeply this time. After stabilizing her condition, he tested the tonic. Traces of digitalis again, not enough to kill, but enough to terrify. No doors were forced, no windows broken. No strangers seen. The bottle had only 2 sets of fingerprints, Eleanor's and Clara's. The chemist swore he had sent the correct dose, sealed and labelled. But the apothecary's apprentice, when questioned quietly by Miss Havers, mentioned that a visitor had asked to pick up Eleanor's prescription hours before Clara arrived. That visitor, Mr. Felix Mortimer, the estate's former legal man, now inexplicably researching local history for a book no one had seen him write. That evening, Eleanor sent for Miss Havers herself. The request was unexpected. yet oddly timed. When Miss Havers arrived, Eleanor was already seated by the fire, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders like armor woven from shame. Her face was hollow, drawn not just from illness, but from the toll of waiting, and she began to speak, not in full confession, but in fragments. At first she referred only to the girl, carefully skirting the name. "She came to me," she said, with a story, a terrible one. Her voice trembled, said something had happened in the East Wing. At night, I told her she was mistaken, or perhaps I told myself. The girl Beatrice had come to Eleanor, distraught, shaken, barely able to hold her hand still. She'd claimed that someone in the household, a man of stature and confidence, had harmed her, not physically alone, but in a way that left scars beneath the skin. Eleanor hadn't believed her, or maybe, as she now admitted, she hadn't wanted to believe her. She was always emotional, Eleanor whispered, always dramatic, but not this time. Instead of listening, Eleanor had paid her off, fired her quietly, and let the matter die. "I told myself it was the kindest thing," she said softly, "to spare the family, to preserve the name, but Beatrice left with nothing, and 2 weeks later she was gone." They had found her near Hollow Brook, her body lying face down in the shallows, her death labeled an accident. No investigation followed, no questions asked. The silence was mutual and binding. Eleanor never spoke of her again, not even to her closest friend, Mrs. Arleston. But now, years later, with Miss Elliston dead and her own body twice poisoned, Eleanor understood. "Someone remembers," she murmured. "Someone knows." Miss Havers rose slowly, her face unreadable. She didn't offer comfort nor judgment. She simply stood by the fire and stared at the flickering flames. The past, she realized, had not just returned, it had grown claws. Someone had watched, and now they were exacting justice in the most precise way possible, not through confession, not through courtrooms, but through fear, memory, and slow, deliberate retribution. The reckoning had begun, and it would not end until all debts were paid in full. Eleanor Merton had spent most of her years behind carefully constructed walls, emotional fortresses built not of stone but of silence, social grace, and decades-old omissions. But lately, something or someone had begun dismantling those barriers, not with a hammer, but with whispers. Whispers that grew louder in the corridors of her mind, louder still in the quiet pauses between words during parish meetings, and loudest when she was alone in her drawing room, hearing the faint creak of floorboards where no one stood. The past, long buried under polished silverware and rehearsed smiles, had not forgiven her for what she had chosen to ignore, and now it had returned not as memory, but as a presence, watchful, patient, unrelenting. Following her near poisoning, Eleanor's once proud composure shattered like thin porcelain. Her days became filled with shadows she couldn't name, her nights punctuated by the rustle of curtains she no longer trusted to stay still. She asked questions, half-formed and frantic. Had anyone seen the old gardener's daughter back in town? Had the boy who once delivered the Sunday milk come asking after the archives? She feared letters, she feared footsteps, she feared faces she couldn't place, but most of all she feared the one thing she could not see, motive. The idea that someone had not just remembered, but waited, and was now acting. She brought these thoughts to Miss Havers, retired librarian, known for her quilts, her unflinching sense of decorum, and her unparalleled gift of reading between lines people didn't even know they'd written. Miss Havers, ever the observer, did not respond immediately. Instead, she listened with the same stillness as someone watching a spider spin a web, careful not to interrupt the pattern. Eleanor mentioned her nephew, Lionel, who had asked about the unused cellar grate. She mentioned her niece, who'd brought her tea with trembling hands. She mentioned seeing their housemaid, Sylvia, hovering by the attic stairs one night, clutching a faded envelope. But Miss Havers said nothing, because she was already thinking of someone else, not the obvious suspects, no. In her experience, vengeance was rarely the domain of the brash. It did not arrive with shouting or show. It wore quiet shoes. It moved through doorways carrying trays and linens. It knew how to be invisible. Miss Havers began to watch Sylvia, not harshly, but with calibrated interest. Sylvia had always been reliable, polite, unassuming, but recently she had grown too quiet, too careful. The baker's wife noticed her reading by candlelight long after others had slept. The grocer said she stared too long at the locket on the counter display. And the verger's widow whispered to Miss Havers one morning after service. I heard her cry out a name, Clara, just once, then silence. Digging into the parish registries, Miss Havers unearthed a forgotten name, Clara Harrow, a young maid once dismissed from the Merton estate for fabricating stories. She had died within months of leaving, under circumstances no one had properly investigated. Clara had claimed someone in the household had taken advantage of her. She had gone to Eleanor, and Eleanor had chosen silence, chosen to protect the family name over a servant girl's pain. That silence, Miss Havers now believed, had borne fruit. Dangerous fruit in the form of Sylvia, who was not just a maid, not just a girl from nowhere, she was Clara's daughter, and she had returned. The tea invitation was written in Miss Havers's tidy hand, phrased as a casual gathering, though every name on the list was deliberate. Eleanor, her nephew Lionel, the housemaid Sylvia, and a quiet clerk from the estate office named Martin, who had also once been close to Clara. The sitting room was arranged meticulously. Lace doilies, plum cake, porcelain cups, all mismatched except for one, Clara's old cup, long stored away, now placed subtly in Sylvia's reach. The air was thick, not just with steam, but with expectation. The conversation stumbled over weather and festival plans. The silver spoon stirred too loudly. No one touched the cake. Then Miss Havers gently turned the tide. "You know," she said, "I often think the past is like tea. Leave it too long and it grows bitter. Best faced when still warm." Sylvia stiffened. Her eyes fell to the floral cup. Lionel looked from one face to another, as if finally realizing he was not in control. Eleanor's hand trembled on the armrest, her face pale beneath powder. No accusations were made. None were needed. For in that silence, something passed between them all. An unspoken recognition, a convergence of guilt, loss, and a reckoning long postponed. And in that silence, Sylvia smiled, not with malice, not with triumph, but with release, as if she had waited years for someone, anyone, to say aloud what had been whispered through her blood since birth. Miss Havers met her gaze and nodded, almost imperceptibly, for the truth had finally poured itself out, slow, scolding, and impossible to return to the pot. And from that day, the village of Greystone was never quite the same again. Her hands moved with a careful grace that belied the storm behind her eyes that missed nothing, not even the tremor in someone else's breath. When the tea tray returned, and each cup found its rightful hand, Mrs. Hargrove, who had once taught French at the convent, and now lived alone with her orchids and regrets, noticed something no one else did. Ruth, the youngest maid, reached for her cup, then paused, her hand hovering for the briefest second before redirecting, choosing a different one instead. It was the sort of moment most would write off as absent-mindedness, or the awkward shuffle of a nervous girl in a too-quiet room. But to Mrs. Hargrove, who had seen young girls lie about bruises and old women forget where they buried memories, that pause was louder than a scream. A cup means nothing, unless it means everything, and Ruth had chosen carefully, too carefully, only to correct herself too late, her reflex betraying not accident but knowledge. That was the instant the shape of guilt twisted, no longer just suspicion in the abstract, but a living, breathing truth wrapped in plain cotton sleeves and silence. Ruth, always in the background, had made her first real move, unintentionally stepping into the center of a story she had spent years hiding from. But Mrs. Hargrove said nothing, not then. She let the tea pour, and the conversation float above the surface like fallen leaves on a stream. It was not yet time for questions. Truth, she knew, only emerged when cornered softly, after the others had gone, leaving behind only the fading perfume of tension and the soft rattle of silverware. Mrs. Hargrove invited Ruth to sit. Her voice gentle, posture relaxed, almost grandmotherly in its invitation. No accusations, no sharp tones, only the inevitability of two souls approaching a locked door that one of them already held the key to. Ruth sat stiffly, eyes lowered, hands clenched as if bracing for a wind that had already passed. And then Mrs. Hargrove said it. Not as a question but as a statement offered like a folded blanket. "You knew Caroline, didn't you? Not as gossip or ghost story. You knew her as your mother." The silence that followed wasn't denial, nor shock. It was the silence of recognition. Ruth blinked hard, her lips parted then closed again. Then, with a voice that had forgotten how to be heard, she whispered, "They told me she died scrubbing floors, that she slipped, that she had no one left, but that wasn't the truth, was it?" A tear welled, trembled, but did not fall. "I found the letter," she added, quieter still, "behind the hearthstone, in the old scullery, wrapped in wax paper, her handwriting, her scent still clinging to the edges." Ruth spoke, and with every word, the shape of her life twisted into something unfamiliar. The letter had not been addressed to anyone by name, but its sorrow was intimate. Caroline had written of a man who promised her the world, then left her with shame. She had written of betrayal, not just by him but by the household, by the woman she had trusted, who had turned her away with cold eyes and colder words. She said if the letter found no one, it would at least exist, it would remember her. Ruth's voice cracked then, but she kept going. She spoke of how she read the letter dozens of times, trying to find anger, trying to ignite vengeance, but all she found was grief, and a yearning that grew inside her like ivy, curling around her spine and ribs, making her wonder what it would be like if someone had remembered Caroline kindly. That's why she came to work in the same house. That's why she stayed in the shadows. Not to harm but to understand, to witness what kind of people lived in a house that could forget a girl like Caroline. Mrs. Hargrove did not interrupt. She watched as the truth unfolded, not with screams or denials, but with fragile honesty. Ruth had not poisoned anyone. She had switched the cups, yes, but not with malice. She had hoped someone else would choose the one meant for her, just to see if guilt lived in others too, just to see if the past left even a trace. The cup, it turned out, wasn't a weapon. It was a test, and the real poison, Mrs. Hargrove understood now, had been silence. Silence passed down like an heirloom. The room, once heavy with tension, now echoed with something sadder, acknowledgement, and as the wind stirred the curtains and the fire died to coals, Mrs. Hargrove reached for Ruth's hand, not to accuse but to steady. "Then perhaps, my dear," she whispered, "it's time someone remembered her rightly. She hadn't meant to kill, not truly, not in the way a murderer means it, with calculation or cruelty, but in a quieter, more sorrowful sense, as one who seeks not death but memory, not punishment but a reckoning too long denied." Clara had grown up in foster homes that taught silence more than speech, survival more than love, but in the brittle corners of her heart, there had always remained the faint trace of a woman she had never truly known, her mother Harriet, whose name had been whispered once in a nurse's hasty explanation, then buried under redacted records and dismissive shrugs. And yet when Clara, decades later and under a borrowed surname, had stepped through the towering doors of Wexley House, she had felt it, not memory, but recognition, a cold, dormant ache rising beneath polished floors and painted portraits. The house remembered her even if its mistress did not. Eleanor Wexley had once dismissed Harriet with the elegance of a woman washing her hands. Scandal was implied, disgrace arranged, and the girl who had once cleaned her silver vanished without so much as a farewell. Harriet had written only once. A letter never mailed, folded behind ledgers in the vicarage pantry, yellowed and desperate. Clara found it by chance while helping the local curate catalogue donations. Her hands trembled as she read the slanted script, every word a wound reopened, every sentence an echo of abandonment. "If they silence me, let someone remember that I was kind, that I loved and lost and was not wicked, only left behind." Clara had memorized the lines, recited them like scripture in the dark, until love fermented into grief and grief soured into something colder. Eleanor had thrived, seen at galas, her name printed in newsletters beneath columns praising her donations and grace. She wore pearls like armor and carried herself with the arrogance of the unpunished. And Clara, silent, invisible, obedient, watched. She made no move for months, not until she noticed the blue teacup rimmed with gold, the one Eleanor claimed exclusively at every gathering, the one she wouldn't even allow a guest to handle. It became a symbol, not of habit, but of entitlement. It was there Clara placed the belladonna, measured with trembling precision from a discarded medical kit tucked in the attic's farthest corner, relic of Eleanor's late physician husband. She used just enough to cause fear, not death. A racing heart, a dizzying breathlessness, something to make Eleanor feel what Harriet might have felt the day she was cast out. But the tea service changed. Seats were shifted. No announcement. No time to stop it. Mrs. Bramley, with her delicate lace gloves and shaking hands, sat where Eleanor should have. She sipped, smiled politely, and within minutes collapsed, gasping for breath, eyes wide with confusion and pain. Clara watched in frozen horror as chaos unfolded. She hadn't moved, hadn't run. The guilt set in instantly, raw, acidic, and yet she said nothing, not out of cowardice but because she didn't know what truth would look like once spoken. It wasn't Miss Verity Lorne, the soft-spoken guest with a fondness for roses and a sharp eye, who accused her, but Clara herself, unraveling days later under the weight of silence. Verity had seen the twitch of Clara's hand during the service, the moment of hesitation when the tray was passed, the subtle dread in her eyes as the wrong woman sipped from the wrong cup. When Clara finally confessed, it was not a plea, but a laying down of burdens. "She wasn't just my mother," she said quietly. "She was someone you all chose to forget." Verity said little. Only that memory, when denied too long, could turn into something dangerous. The constable arrived the next morning, summoned discreetly, and even he, upon hearing the full tale, hesitated to put handcuffs on a girl whose crime had been born not of malice, but of unwept mourning. Clara walked from Wexley House without protest, her steps slow but steady, her eyes neither pleading nor defiant. The villagers watched from behind curtains and half-shuttered windows, their murmurs hushed not by fear, but by shame, for hadn't they too failed to ask what became of Harriet? Days later, in a moment no one could have anticipated, Eleanor Wexley stood in the centre aisle of the village chapel, her back straight but her voice quivering. She did not beg forgiveness. She did not name names. She simply said, "There was a girl in my care, to whom I showed no kindness. She died without justice. I carry that, nothing more." But in that silence which followed, something shifted. Not redemption perhaps, but recognition. As spring winds moved through the chapel's cracked stained glass, and petals from the dogwood trees danced across the pews, Clara's story, Harriet's story, no longer belonged to the dust. It had been spoken at last. The cottage at the edge of Fairwood Hollow had stood quiet for years, its shutters drawn like eyes that refused to witness, its garden overgrown with nettles and whispers. But now, as dusk descended with a sky bruised in hues of violet and rust, a presence stirred behind its warped wooden door, not one of terror, but of release. Eleanor Hawthorne, once the iron-spined matriarch of the Hollow's governing council, sat beneath the weathered arch of her porch, not with a book or tea, but with silence, the kind that arrives only after a truth has clawed its way out from under generations of lies. She had spoken in church that morning, unannounced and without title, her words cutting through the air like the tolling of a long unrung bell. "There was a child here once, who came to us for safety, and to whom I offered neither kindness nor justice. I failed her, and I remember." No name had been given, yet the entire congregation, from the vicar's wife to the boy who swept the steps of the greengrocer, knew precisely to whom she referred. The silence that followed had been more profound than any prayer. It did not forgive, but it understood. Miss Lillian Merrow, who had long walked with a cane and a sharper tongue, was seen lowering her gaze. The baker's son fidgeted with a hymn book he hadn't opened in years. And seated near the rear in a pew long claimed by ivy-scented history, sat Verity Gray, the quiet schoolteacher with sea-glass eyes, who had begun this unraveling months earlier when she found a diary wedged behind the stone foundation of the chapel library. That diary had belonged to Marianne Vale, a girl lost to the village nearly 3 decades before, whose name had vanished from registers but never from the walls of the Hollow, where her laughter once echoed before it was smothered. Her story had been dismissed as hysteria, as punishment, as something no longer convenient to remember. And yet Verity had remembered, every fragmented sentence, every ink-blotted page filled with pleas to be seen, to be believed, to not be buried beneath propriety. It had taken Verity weeks to piece the diary's fragments into coherence, and longer still to confront the woman who once held power over Marianne's fate, Eleanor, whose silence had not protected the girl but sentenced her to oblivion. Now, as the twilight bled across the hills and fireflies blinked like scattered thoughts, Eleanor sat alone, no longer the bastion of Fairwood's respectability, but something smaller, a figure weighed down not by age but consequence. She had not asked for forgiveness, she had not wept, but her hands clasped together on her lap, trembled like leaves in windless air. Verity watched from the orchard path, unseen, carrying in her pocket the final page of Marianne's diary, a note that simply read, "If they forget me, let someone plant something wild where I used to play." The next morning, Verity returned to the orchard with a spade and a packet of wildflower seeds. No announcement, no audience, just soft soil and the promise that memory once rooted could bloom where even guilt had failed. The village spoke little of that spring, and what they did say was wrapped in suggestion rather than names. Mr. Halloway, the estate lawyer, left without fanfare. Mrs. Ambrose, who once spread rumours like butter, sent weekly letters to the orphanage she had once condemned. Change came not through trials, but through tremors, soft, persistent, and unforgettable. At the edge of the Hollow, beneath the watchful hush of dusk, Eleanor lit a single lamp in her window, not to guide anyone home, but to ensure she herself no longer hid from the dark. And as Miss Verity Gray passed by with her basket of papers and wild flowers, she did not stop, did not wave, but inclined her head, not in absolution, but in recognition that remembrance, though late, had finally been born. In Fairwood Hollow, where secrets had once been as thick as ivy on stone, there now lingered something lighter, not innocence, but the honest ache of history. And beneath the apple trees that had once shaded a girl forgotten by time, the first wild flowers began to bloom. Somewhere beyond the whispering hedgerows of Elmridge Lane, where the air always seemed to carry a secret too old to name, and the chiming of the chapel bell sounded less like a call to worship, and more like a warning, the long-forgotten Blackthorn house stood draped in ivy and unresolved history. That evening, as a crimson dusk spilled across the windows like blood through lace, Eleanor Vane found herself standing in the parlour once more, the room untouched since her aunt's passing, preserved like a museum of grief, with curtains drawn and dust settled like quiet judgment. Her fingers, tentative but resolute, drifted over faded doilies and porcelain trinkets until they came to rest on a drawer that stuck slightly, as if it too was reluctant to reveal what lay within. Inside was a single letter, yellowed with time and sealed with wax so brittle it crumbled beneath her thumb. No name, no date, just silence captured in paper. But the moment she unfolded it, the air itself seemed to shift, as though the walls remembered the words before she did. The letter spoke of Marianne, not as the reckless girl everyone whispered about, but as someone wronged, silenced, and sacrificed to keep the illusion of decency intact. Her disappearance had always been a wound wrapped in politeness, a tragedy buried beneath layers of small-town etiquette, where people pretended not to notice bruises behind veils or tears shed behind hedges. But here, in ink blurred by time and regret, was something that cut deeper than speculation, an admission of betrayal, of complicity, of love twisted by fear. Eleanor read the letter twice, then placed it gently on the wooden bench in the garden, right where Marianne once read poetry aloud beneath the lavender sky, her laughter echoing like wind chimes before it vanished forever. Across the lane, old Miriam Weller stood at her attic window, her weathered hands trembling around a teacup she hadn't touched since the day Marianne came crying to her door, soaked, frantic, barefoot, and was turned away with a lie about propriety and place. She had told herself it wasn't her business. That regret had followed her through marriages, miscarriages, and the quiet years of widowhood, and now it gripped her throat with more force than age ever had. At the church gate, Henry Grayson, a young boy when it all happened, now a man with children of his own, laid flowers not on a grave but at the gate where Marianne's ribbon was last seen, caught like a ghost's sigh on the iron spikes. These gestures, quiet, humble, delayed, weren't redemption, but echoes of a truth too long denied. Eleanor didn't cry. Not because she wasn't moved, but because she had crossed into a realm where tears felt too fragile to carry the weight of history. The garden, once fragrant with innocence, now smelled of confession. The wind stirred the letter and the roses beside it, their petals trembling as though remembering their own first bloom, their first loss. In the stillness, justice did not arrive in uniform or verdict, but in a slow reckoning, the kind that crawls through the bones at night and revisits you in dreams. This wasn't just about Marianne, it was about everyone who had chosen silence over truth, convenience over courage. The village had not forgotten, it had chosen not to remember, and tonight that choice unraveled. Miss Eleanor didn't speak as she walked back into the house, but her every step sounded like a sentence pronounced. The lamp flickered once, as if the past itself sighed. In the attic, Miriam finally wrote a letter of her own, not to send, but to say what she never dared. At the chapel, Henry stayed long after the stars came out, not praying, just listening, perhaps to the wind, perhaps to something older. And in the blackthorn garden, beneath the weight of remembrance, the roses stood witness. We tell ourselves the past can be folded neatly and tucked away like winter clothes, but history breathes through floors that creak at the wrong moment, through letters misplaced for decades, through a cup left on the wrong shelf. So I ask you, if you had found that letter, would you have read it? Would you have shared it? Or would you have let it vanish again into the drawers of denial? Let us know below. Your voices are part of this story too. And if you found yourself drawn into this unraveling of forgotten truth, if the scent of old roses and the echo of withheld names moved something in you today, stay with us. There are more stories like this, not in books but buried in silence. Until next time, keep your heart open, your memory sharp, and always, always look twice before closing a drawer. It might just be waiting for someone brave enough to listen.